A retired K-9, after years of loyal service to the police, starts barking nonstop, something he never did before. At first, the officers think it's just an odd quirk. Maybe he's just excited. But then, the barking grows more frantic, more desperate, almost as if he's trying to tell them something. As the tension builds, the officers are forced to investigate. What they discover beneath the floor, it would change everything. What was hidden? What secret was this loyal K-9 trying to uncover? Stay with us, because this shocking twist will leave you speechless. This is a story you won't believe until you see it for yourself. Let's dive in. The morning sun filtered through the windows of the small police station, casting a warm, golden light across the room. It was a typical quiet day, with officers chatting over coffee and reviewing paperwork. Among them sat an older, retired K-9 named Max, once a fierce and reliable member of the force, now living out his golden years in peace. He had served his time well, sniffing out drugs, protecting his handler, and helping solve countless cases. Now, he was content to lounge on his bed near the office, his days of chasing criminals behind him. But today was different. It started with a low whine, almost imperceptible at first. Max, usually calm and composed, lifted his head from his resting spot, his eyes scanning the room as though searching for something that wasn't immediately visible. The officers, accustomed to his usual indifference, brushed it off. Max had always been a quiet dog in retirement, only moving when there was food or the occasional treat to entice him. But the whining grew louder. It was now a persistent, almost frantic sound. The officers exchanged puzzled glances. "What's got into him today?" one of them muttered. Another officer, Jake, who had worked with Max for years, stood up and walked over to his old companion. He knelt down to pet the dog, hoping to calm him, but Max didn't respond to the comforting touch. His body was tense, his ears erect, and his nostrils flared, as if he had caught wind of something only he could sense. Max's barking began shortly after. First a few sharp barks, then an unrelenting barrage that filled the room. He stood on all fours now, his tail stiff, his eyes wild with a strange intensity. This wasn't the Max they knew, the dog who had always been so calm and content in retirement. Something was seriously wrong. Jake, a seasoned officer who had seen his fair share of strange situations, was starting to feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He had worked with Max for years during their time on the force, and he knew better than anyone that the dog's instincts were always spot on. If Max was reacting this way, there had to be a reason. Something was out of place. "Max, what is it, boy?" Jake said softly, his voice filled with concern as he reached for the dog's collar. But Max only barked louder, his body trembling with a kind of urgency that made Jake's heart race. The dog wasn't barking at anyone in particular. He wasn't reacting to an intruder or another dog. No, this seemed different. It was as if Max was trying to communicate something deeper, something hidden. The other officers in the room began to take notice, their curiosity piqued. They watched as Max continued to bark frantically, his eyes now fixed on a spot in the corner of the room, a place where nothing seemed to be out of the ordinary. It was an empty corner, filled only with discarded boxes and old equipment. Yet, to Max, it seemed as if the corner held a secret, a danger he was trying to warn them about. Jake's instincts kicked into high gear. He stood up and motioned for the others to follow him. "I think we need to check it out," he said, his voice steady, but filled with urgency. The other officers hesitated for a moment, unsure of what exactly they were looking for. But Jake's serious tone made them quickly gather their gear and prepare for whatever might lie ahead. Max's barking was now deafening, his voice echoing through the small space. His eyes never left that corner, and his body was vibrating with a strange energy that only a K-9 of his experience could produce. It was as if Max could sense something, a hidden threat or a mystery that was buried just out of sight. The officers, now fully alert, began to cautiously approach the spot Max was fixated on. Jake crouched down near the corner, peering at the area Max had been staring at for so long. The floor was old, worn down with years of use, and the walls showed signs of wear, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. He ran his hand along the floorboards, inspecting them for any signs of damage. That's when he felt it, a slight dip in the wood, almost as if there was something beneath it. His heart skipped a beat. Max's barking intensified, as if urging him to act. Without hesitation, Jake reached for a nearby crowbar, prying up the wooden floorboards with careful precision. The sound of the nails groaning, as the wood was pulled away, sent a shiver down his spine. Beneath the floorboards, the officers found what they least expected, a hidden compartment sealed off from the rest of the room. Max stopped barking, but his eyes were still locked on the spot, his tail now still, waiting for the officers to uncover whatever secret was hidden below. The officers exchanged glances, their minds racing with possibilities. What could be hidden here? Why had Max reacted this way? With trembling hands, Jake pried open the compartment. As the dust settled and the light from their flashlights flickered over the contents, the officers' jaws dropped. Inside, they found stacks of money, large amounts of cash, tightly wrapped in plastic. But that wasn't all. Alongside the money was a small, locked briefcase, its contents unknown. The officers froze, the weight of the discovery hitting them all at once. How had this ended up hidden beneath the floor of their own station? And why had Max, a retired K-9, been the one to uncover it? Jake's eyes narrowed. This isn't just a coincidence, he muttered. Max just uncovered something we never should have found. The mystery had just begun. The silence in the room was deafening as the officers stared down at the hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. The faint smell of dust and old wood filled the air, mixing with the unsettling realization that Max had led them here, to a secret they never knew existed. They had all seen their fair share of surprises over the years, drugs, weapons, evidence. But this was something entirely different. Jake, still holding the crowbar, knelt down to examine the stacks of cash and the mysterious briefcase. His fingers trembled slightly as he brushed aside the old, crumbling floorboards, revealing the treasure hidden beneath them. The bundles of money were wrapped tightly in plastic, and although he couldn't estimate the exact amount at first glance, it was clear that this was no small stash. As Jake lifted one of the bundles, he felt the weight of it, a chill running down his spine. "How long has this been here?" one of the officers whispered, clearly unsettled. Another officer, Sarah, spoke up from behind him. "Who would have known about this? Who would have hidden it right here under our noses?" Jake's mind raced. He had spent years working alongside Max, trusting the dog's instincts implicitly. Max had always been able to sense things that others couldn't, whether it was the faintest trace of drugs or the shift of a criminal's mood. But now Max's behavior was taking on a whole new layer of meaning. The K-9 had barked nonstop at the floor, as if trying to communicate something urgent. The dog's incredible nose had detected something that was right beneath their feet. And now they had found it. Jake gently placed the stack of cash aside and reached for the locked briefcase that lay alongside it. Its cold, metallic surface gleamed under the light, and he couldn't help but feel a twinge of curiosity. What could be so important, so dangerous, that someone would go to such lengths to hide it beneath the floorboards of a police station? The lock on the briefcase was sturdy, but Jake was used to dealing with locked containers. After a few moments of fiddling with the mechanism, he heard a click. The briefcase popped open with a soft, almost reluctant sound. The officers held their breath, their eyes wide with anticipation. Inside the briefcase, nestled between layers of thick padding, was something far more unexpected than anyone had anticipated. It wasn't more money. It wasn't more drugs. It wasn't weapons or stolen goods. Instead, there was a collection of documents, old, yellowed papers bound together with a faded leather strap. A file. But this wasn't an ordinary file. This was a file that looked as if it had been sealed away for years, perhaps even decades. Max, who had been standing quietly by the officers, suddenly sat down. His attention remained fixed on the briefcase, as if he understood the gravity of the moment. The officers took tentative steps closer to the briefcase, unable to look away. The air in the room felt heavy, thick with suspense. What could these documents contain? Jake picked up the file carefully, as though it might break apart in his hands. The paper was brittle, and as he flipped it open, a strange sense of foreboding washed over him. The first few pages were filled with detailed records, handwritten notes, sketches, and photos that appeared to be decades old. At first glance, they seemed to have little in common with the normal investigative reports Jake was used to seeing. But as his eyes scanned the documents more closely, the truth became clear. The file contained records of an operation involving corrupt officers within the very department they worked in. Jake's heart skipped a beat. His mind raced as he pieced together the information. There were photographs of old colleagues, now long retired, alongside images of suspects, criminals with known ties to organized crime. There were coded notes, references to money laundering, and strange mentions of certain events that didn't make sense. The more Jake read, the clearer it became that the operation had been buried, swept under the rug for fear of its secrets coming to light. "Holy crap," Sarah whispered under her breath as she leaned over Jake's shoulder to read the papers. This is huge." The more they looked, the more the officers realized the depth of what they had uncovered. Someone had been using the police station as a cover for a series of illegal activities, and it had been going on for years. The case had been cold, buried, and likely forgotten by most. But now, with Max's unexpected intervention, it was all coming to the surface once again. Max had been retired for years, his time on the force over. Yet here he was, barking, growling, and insisting they look closer. It was as though the dog knew more than anyone else in the room. Was it possible that Max had picked up on something? Had he somehow sensed the presence of the hidden documents, hidden deep under the floorboards? The thought seemed impossible, but at the same time it was undeniable. The retired K-9 had led them to this moment where everything had changed. "Who would have known?" another officer muttered, his voice filled with awe and disbelief. How many people were involved in this? Jake stood up, the file clutched tightly in his hands, his mind racing with a million thoughts. "We've got to take this to the chief. We've got to figure out who else was involved, and we need to make sure that the people responsible are held accountable." The officers exchanged grim looks. They knew this was far from over. What they had discovered was just the beginning. There was a web of corruption within their own department, one that had been hidden in plain sight for far too long. Max had given them the key to unraveling it all. But the truth they were about to uncover was more dangerous than anything they had ever faced before. Max, sitting quietly at their feet, seemed to understand. He had done his job. He had found what needed to be found. But now the real work would begin. "Let's go," Jake said, his voice steady with determination. "We've got a lot of work ahead of us." With Max at their side, they left the small room, knowing they had just uncovered something that would change everything. What had seemed like an ordinary day had turned into an extraordinary discovery, and there was no turning back now. The stakes were higher than ever, and the officers knew they were on the brink of something that would shake the foundation of their entire department. And Max, he had known all along. The air in the room felt thick, laden with disbelief. The officers, still reeling from the shocking discovery beneath the floorboards, exchanged stunned glances. They had always known their job could be dangerous, full of surprises. But this was something else entirely. They weren't just facing an ordinary criminal operation or drug bust. What they had just uncovered was a betrayal, a cancer within their own ranks, something far more personal. Max, the retired K-9, sat calmly by their feet, his intense gaze fixed on the file in Jake's hands. The dog's unblinking stare seemed to say more than words ever could, almost as though he had already known what they would find. It was as if the dog had unlocked the secret of this place, a secret buried for years beneath layers of wood, dust, and silence. Sarah, the youngest officer among them, was the first to break the silence. Her voice trembled slightly, but there was no mistaking the weight of what she was about to say. "Are we really seeing this right?" she asked, her words almost a whisper, as if speaking too loudly would shatter the gravity of the moment. Jake, still holding the file, nodded slowly. His mind was racing, but his hands, surprisingly steady, flipped through the remaining pages. The photographs, the coded messages, the mention of high-profile figures, everything pointed to one simple, horrific truth. Someone inside the department had been working with criminals, covering their tracks for years. The file was more than just an archive of a failed operation. It was the blueprint for a conspiracy. "Yeah," Jake muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "It's real?" Sarah took a step back, her breath coming in short, shocked gasps. Her eyes were wide, pupils dilated with the realization of what they had stumbled upon. She had joined the force because she believed in justice, in upholding the law. She had always been proud to wear the badge. But now, that sense of pride felt tainted. The officers who were supposed to protect the community had been the ones pulling the strings from the shadows. How deep did this go? How many people had been involved? Mark, an older officer with years of experience, was the next to speak. His voice was low, his words measured. "This could ruin everything," he said. "If the wrong people find out—" "I don't even think the wrong people know about this," Sarah interrupted, her voice full of confusion and anger. "This was kept hidden for a reason. We're the ones stumbling onto it." The tension in the room was palpable. The officers, who had once seen themselves as a close-knit team, now found themselves questioning everything. Who could they trust? How far had this corruption spread? The realization that their own colleagues, people they had worked alongside, laughed with, and shared difficult cases with, might be involved in such a dark web of deceit was overwhelming. Jake's gaze remained fixed on the file. His mind was struggling to make sense of the images and notes. The more he read, the more he understood just how methodical this operation had been. The criminals, the ones who had been pulling the strings, had known how to play the system. They'd manipulated it, bent it to their will, using officers as pawns in a much larger game. And it had worked. Until now. This is bigger than we thought," Jake said finally, his voice grim. "We need to take this to the chief, but we can't trust anyone in the department right now. We don't know who else might be involved." Mark nodded in agreement. He had been around long enough to know that the lines between right and wrong were often blurry. But this was something else. This was pure corruption. And it wasn't just going to disappear. "Are we just supposed to trust the chief with this?" Sarah asked, her frustration rising. "How do we know they aren't involved? How do we know this isn't just a part of the system working as it always has?" Her words hung in the air like a challenge, and for a moment, no one spoke. The officers were left standing there, uncertain and unsure of who to turn to. The police force, the institution they had worked so hard to protect, suddenly felt like a house of cards, ready to collapse at any moment. Jake could sense the unease in the room. He knew they had to act fast, but he also understood Sarah's concerns. There was a risk in going to the chief, but there was also a risk in sitting on this information and doing nothing. There were people out there who had been operating with impunity for years, and now they had the chance to bring it all into the light. "We can't sit on this," Jake said, his voice steady now. "We need to expose it, but we have to be smart. If we act too quickly, we could be walking right into their hands. We need to think this through." Max, who had been quietly observing the scene unfold, gave a low growl. It was a sound filled with urgency, as if the dog understood the peril they were facing. His ears perked up, and his eyes, sharp and focused, shifted to the file in Jake's hands. It was clear that Max was just as alert as ever, ready to take action, as if his years of training had never left him. "I think Max agrees," Jake said with a half-smile, though the weight of the situation was too heavy for any real humor. We need to keep our heads in the game. This is far from over. And if we're going to expose this, we need to do it carefully. The officers stood in silence for a moment, each one lost in their thoughts. They had all come into this job with the intention of serving justice, of righting wrongs. But now, with the discovery of the secret beneath the floorboards, everything had changed. Their world, their community, had just been rocked to its core. Mark clapped Jake on the back. Let's get this to the right people. We'll handle it from there. But as the officers moved to leave the room, a lingering question remained in the air unanswered. Who else knew? And how far did this conspiracy really go? The officers stood in the quiet room, their hearts pounding as they exchanged uneasy glances. They had uncovered something they never expected. Max, the retired K-9, had barked relentlessly for what seemed like hours, his deep, guttural growls filling the space with a sense of urgency. There was something beneath the floor, something hidden and dangerous, something that demanded attention. At first, the officers thought it was just the dog's usual excitement. Max had been a seasoned K-9, trained to sniff out drugs, explosives, and the most dangerous criminals. But tonight, something was different. His bark was frantic, almost as if he could sense the tension in the room, the weight of something unspeakable buried beneath their feet. Jake, the lead officer, crouched down beside Max, his hand resting on the dog's head, attempting to calm him. But Max wasn't having it. The dog's eyes were wide, his tail rigid, and his nose was pressed to the ground. He pawed at the wooden floor, as if trying to dig through the layers of dust and age that had accumulated over the years. There was no mistake. Max had found something. This is it, Jake murmured to himself. His fingers gripped the floorboards, each creak of the wood beneath his touch heightening the suspense. Max is telling us something. He knows something we don't. Sarah, the youngest officer, watched with a mixture of curiosity and unease. She had seen a lot in her short career, high-speed chases, armed standoffs, and intense investigations, but nothing had prepared her for the tension that was building in the room. It felt like they were on the verge of uncovering a dark, hidden truth, and there was no telling what they would find once they dug deeper. The room was silent, except for Max's low growls. The officers exchanged another look, and without a word, they grabbed the tools needed to pry up the floorboards. The tension was suffocating, as if the very air in the room had thickened, awaiting the discovery that was about to unfold. Jake's hand shook as he slid a crowbar beneath the floorboards, pulling them up with deliberate force. The first board creaked, and then the second one. With each pull, the officers' anticipation grew. But what would they find? Drugs? Stolen goods? It was impossible to say. But Max's insistence, his unrelenting focus on this one spot, suggested something far more sinister than the usual criminal contraband. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the last of the floorboards came free, revealing a dark, narrow space below. Jake lowered himself into the hole, the dim light of his flashlight dancing over the floor. His heart skipped a beat when he saw what was hidden there. It wasn't drugs or stolen property that lay beneath the floor, but a collection of old files. Stacked carefully, almost meticulously, they were bound in leather, their yellowed pages crinkling with age. But it wasn't the papers that made Jake's blood run cold. It was what the files represented. They were official police documents, detailing covert operations, undercover missions, and, most shockingly, the names of high-ranking officers involved in operations they had no business being a part of. The discovery hit like a punch to the gut. The files weren't just evidence of a few rogue criminals operating within the force. They were the skeletons of a much larger conspiracy, one that had been carefully hidden for years. Jake's hands trembled as he picked up the first file, his mind racing. "This is..." Sarah's voice trailed off, the magnitude of the situation dawning on her as she glanced at the documents. "This is more than we thought. This is deep." Max, still alert and focused, barked again. It was almost as if he was warning them about the truth they were about to uncover. There was no turning back now. Whatever this conspiracy was, it was bigger than anything they had ever faced. And it wasn't just confined to the past, it was still happening. The officers involved, those who had buried these secrets beneath the floor, were still out there. Jake's mind worked quickly, sorting through the piles of papers, scanning the names and locations listed on the documents. There were references to undercover operations, names of informants, and most chilling of all, encrypted messages that led to even darker connections. As he flipped through the pages, it became clear that whoever had hidden these files had gone to great lengths to protect their identity, to make sure their operations stayed off the radar. "I can't believe this," Jake said, his voice low and shaken. He couldn't comprehend the depth of the betrayal that had taken place. How could anyone inside the force be involved in this kind of thing? Sarah crouched beside him, her face pale with disbelief. "This is everything we've been fighting against. And it's right here, right under our noses." Max's bark broke through the silence. Once again, his eyes were fixed on Jake, as though urging him to move faster. It was clear that Max understood the urgency of the situation, his instincts warning him of the danger still lurking. Do you think it's still happening?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake didn't answer immediately. He could feel the weight of the discovery pressing down on him. The files in his hands were evidence of corruption at the highest levels, but they were also a weapon, one that could destroy everything the department stood for. But they had no choice. They had to expose the truth. "We need to get these to the right people," Jake said firmly. "But we have to be careful. Whoever hid these, they're still out there, and they won't stop until they cover their tracks." As the officers prepared to leave, their thoughts heavy with the magnitude of what they had just uncovered, Max's growl deepened, and for the first time, it felt like the dog knew just how much danger they were in. The secrets beneath the floorboards were more than just a mystery. They were a ticking time bomb, and they had just set it off. The weight of the discovery hung heavy in the air. As Jake, Sarah, and Max stood in the dimly lit room, the air felt thick with the revelation that had just unfolded. The old, dusty floorboards were now lifted, and the carefully hidden files were exposed. Jake's hand trembled as he held the stack of documents, each one a piece of the puzzle that had been hidden for years. Max, the retired K-9, still stood vigilant, his sharp eyes never leaving the stack of papers, as if he knew how dangerous this moment truly was. The files weren't just old paperwork. They were a map to something far darker. They detailed covert operations, high-ranking officers involved in illegal activities, and names that should never have been linked to corruption. Some of the files even referenced an underground network, people in power, both inside and outside the police force, who were working together to cover up their tracks. Jake scanned the first file again, his mind racing. The encrypted messages were chilling, revealing code words that hinted at an operation far more extensive than he could have ever imagined. It was like unraveling a web of deception, and at the center of it were some of the very officers he had once called his colleagues. It wasn't just a few bad apples. It was an entire network, one that had been thriving for years. "Do you think this goes all the way to the top?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. She couldn't bring herself to fully process the truth. After all, if they were right, it meant their entire understanding of the police department was a lie. Everything they had worked for, everything they had believed in, was being undermined by the very system they had pledged to uphold. "I don't know," Jake muttered, his voice full of disbelief. "But these names, these operations, they point to something bigger. Something we've been blind to." Max, standing by their side, seemed to sense the urgency. His posture was rigid, alert. His low growl vibrated through the room as if to remind them that this moment was not only a revelation, but also a dangerous turning point. The officers now found themselves at a crossroads, one that could change everything they had ever known. Suddenly, a cold realization swept over Jake. "We need to get these out of here," he said, his voice firm. "We can't let anyone know we found them." It was clear now that whoever had hidden these files was not finished. This wasn't just a past mistake they were uncovering. The people involved in this conspiracy were still very much in control, and they would do whatever it took to cover their tracks. As the officers carefully gathered the files, their minds raced with the consequences of what they had found. They were about to expose one of the largest criminal conspiracies within the police department, an empire built on lies, corruption, and betrayal. But how far would they be willing to go to protect their secrets? Jake and Sarah exchanged glances, both of them understanding that they had just stepped into a world of danger they weren't prepared for. The names listed in the documents weren't just people. They were powerful figures who had the resources and the will to stop anyone who threatened to bring their empire crashing down. The officers knew they would have to be strategic, careful, and quick if they hoped to uncover the truth and stop whatever these individuals were planning next. Max's bark broke through the silence, a loud, sharp sound that echoed in the small room. His eyes were wide, and his stance grew more defensive. He wasn't just an ordinary dog. He was a highly trained K9, a companion who had lived through countless dangerous situations alongside his human partners. And right now he sensed something was coming. "We need to leave," Sarah said, her voice trembling as she turned toward the door. "We need to get out of here before anyone knows what we've found." But even as they made their way to the exit, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see a shadow lurking in the doorway. But the room was still, eerily quiet. The only sound was the echo of their footsteps on the floor. Max remained at Jake's side, as loyal as ever, his instincts guiding them through the uncertain path ahead. They had uncovered a secret that could destroy careers, ruin lives, and shake the foundation of everything they had worked for. But they knew that they couldn't stop now. The truth had to be revealed. As they made their way to the car, Jake's mind raced. He needed to contact the right people, people who could help them take down this corruption, people who had the power to make a real difference. But even as he made the decision, the weight of the situation settled in. The stakes were higher than they had ever been before. There was no turning back. "We're not just exposing criminals," Jake muttered under his breath. "We're taking down an entire system." Max's ears perked up at his side, sensing the gravity of the words. The retired K9 had been through the worst of it in his career, but this was different. This was about exposing a conspiracy that reached to the very core of the institution he had once served. And for Max, the stakes were more than just the safety of his human partners. They were about protecting the integrity of everything they stood for. The truth had been unearthed. Now, it was time to face the consequences. The weight of what Jake and Sarah had uncovered hung over them like a dark cloud. As they sat in their vehicle, the files scattered between them, the magnitude of the discovery began to sink in. Max, the loyal retired K9, lay in the back seat, his sharp eyes alert to every sound, his presence a constant reminder of the mission that was now beyond anything they could have imagined. The truth had been exposed. Hidden files revealing a conspiracy that threatened to unravel everything they thought they knew about the police department. But what truly disturbed them was the realization that this revelation was only the beginning. Jake flipped through the files once more, his hands trembling as he scanned the encrypted messages and names that had been buried under layers of secrecy. The papers weren't just about corrupt officers on the payroll. They revealed a network that spread far deeper, involving people in positions of power, not just within the department, but outside it as well. These were individuals who had managed to keep their dirty dealings hidden for years. And the more Jake read, the more he began to understand that the operation was far larger and more dangerous than they had ever anticipated. "There's no way this was an isolated incident," Sarah muttered under her breath. "This is systematic corruption. They've been running this for years." Jake's mind raced as the pieces of the puzzle started falling into place. The files detailed illegal activities ranging from embezzlement and bribery to much darker dealings, involving organized crime syndicates and corrupt government officials. The most chilling part? The documents seemed to suggest that this was only the tip of the iceberg, that there were still more files, more truths, hidden in plain sight. Max's sudden low growl startled them both, snapping their attention back to the present. The retired K-9 had sensed something they hadn't. His ears were perked, eyes scanning the shadows outside the vehicle. A sharp silence hung in the air. They were no longer alone. "Do you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake nodded slowly. He had heard it too. The faint sound of footsteps in the distance, followed by the soft rustling of leaves, a noise that was too deliberate to be natural. The realization hit them at once. Someone was coming for them. They weren't just after the files anymore. They were after the people who had dared to expose them. Jake's heart raced. They needed to act fast. With one last glance at the files, he shoved them into the glove compartment, locking it tightly. "We need to go. Now." Without a moment's hesitation, Jake started the car, the engine roaring to life as they sped down the road, tires screeching against the asphalt. But the eerie silence that had settled over them moments ago didn't let up. Something wasn't right. They could feel it. Something was lurking just out of view, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Sarah turned her head nervously, eyes scanning the rearview mirror. "Do you think they saw us? Do you think they know we have the files?" Jake didn't answer immediately. His grip tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. "I don't know," he said, his voice steady despite the panic rising inside him. "But we're not taking any chances." Max, ever the loyal companion, let out a soft bark, his eyes trained on something in the distance. Jake's gaze followed Max's lead, but there was nothing to be seen. No figures, no movement, just the open road ahead of them. But they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The hairs on the back of Jake's neck stood on end, a sense of dread creeping over him. The further they drove, the more the weight of their discovery seemed to press down on them. Then, just as they rounded a bend, the flashing lights of a vehicle appeared in the distance. It was too far off to make out the make or model, but the unmistakable red and blue lights were enough to send a surge of fear through Sarah's chest. "They're coming for us," she said, her voice rising with panic. Jake's pulse quickened. The chase had begun. They had to lose them, or risk everything they'd uncovered being lost to the people who would stop at nothing to silence them. "Hold on tight," Jake muttered, his foot slamming on the accelerator as the car shot forward, swerving between lanes, narrowly avoiding a collision with oncoming traffic. But the flashing lights were getting closer. Whoever was behind them was persistent, closing in fast. Max, sensing the urgency, growled again, a deep, guttural sound that filled the car. His body tensed, ready for whatever was about to unfold. He wasn't just a retired K-9. He had been trained for high-stress situations, for moments just like this one. Jake's mind raced. He had only one option left. They needed to make it to the safe house, a hidden location where they could lay low and figure out their next move. But with every passing second, the car behind them gained ground. Suddenly, Jake spotted a side road, a narrow, winding path that could lead them to the safe house. He took a sharp left, throwing the car into a steep incline. The tires screeched against the gravel as they sped down the unfamiliar path, hoping to shake their pursuers. But the chase wasn't over. The sound of the pursuing vehicle's engine roared behind them, growing louder with each passing moment. Time was running out. The pressure was suffocating, the air heavy with the weight of their discovery. They weren't just fighting for their lives now, they were fighting for the truth. The files they had uncovered held the power to bring down a criminal empire that had been operating under the radar for years. And as they raced against time, one question lingered in Jake's mind. Would they make it to safety? Or would the secrets they had uncovered be buried forever? The stakes were higher than ever, and the chilling reality was that they had just entered a game they could no longer back out of. The tension in the air was palpable. Jake's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as they sped down the narrow, twisting road. Behind them, the sound of the pursuing vehicle echoed through the dense forest, each rev of the engine growing louder and more menacing. It wasn't just the chase that made his pulse race. It was the knowledge that they were in possession of information that could bring an entire criminal network to its knees. But as they raced through the night, one question kept haunting him. Who were they really up against? Jake's mind flicked back to the files. The documents had been encrypted, filled with names and hidden codes. But one thing was clear. The extent of the corruption ran far deeper than just a few bad cops. The reach of the conspiracy extended into high-ranking officials, politicians, and powerful figures that were supposed to protect the very people they were now threatening. The gang they had uncovered wasn't just operating on a street level. It had deep roots in the system, a hidden network of corruption that no one had ever suspected. Sarah, her eyes darting between the road and the rearview mirror, could sense Jake's unease. She knew his mind was racing, trying to piece together the fragments of information they had so far. The danger they were in wasn't just from the people chasing them. It was from the people who were trying to keep the truth buried. What if it's bigger than we thought? Sarah finally broke the silence, her voice filled with a mixture of fear and curiosity. What if we're not just dealing with a few bad apples? What if this is something that's been going on for years, decades even? Jake shot her a glance, his eyes filled with resolve. That's exactly what I'm afraid of. Suddenly, Max let out a low growl from the back seat, snapping their attention to the road ahead. In the darkness, something moved, shadowy figures darting across the road, emerging from the woods as if they had been waiting for them. Jake slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt just inches from the figures. Sarah gasped, her heart pounding in her chest. The air was thick with the promise of danger, and the figures in the distance were not just ordinary people. They were dressed in dark, tactical gear, their faces obscured by masks, and they moved with an eerie precision that suggested they were no strangers to high-stakes operations. "Who are they?" Sarah whispered, fear creeping into her voice. Jake's jaw clenched. He didn't have the answers, but he knew one thing for sure. These weren't just regular criminals. Whoever was behind this was organized, calculating, and willing to stop at nothing to protect their empire. The files they had uncovered were too dangerous to let them escape, and now it seemed that someone was ready to do whatever it took to get them back. Max growled again, this time louder, more forceful, as if sensing the gravity of the situation. Jake could feel the dog's tension, his instincts telling him they were about to face an even greater threat than they had anticipated. He knew he had only moments before the situation escalated beyond their control. "We can't just sit here," Jake muttered under his breath. "We need to move now." Before he could make a decision, one of the masked figures raised a hand, signaling for the others to advance. The rest of the group spread out, forming a circle around the vehicle, blocking any path to escape. Jake's mind raced as he looked for an opening, any way to break free from the deadly trap they had walked into. Max's growl turned into a ferocious bark, a warning shot fired from the depths of his soul, as the K9 prepared to do what he was trained to do, defend his team at all costs. The figures began to move closer, but instead of advancing toward Jake and Sarah, they seemed to be circling the vehicle, as if waiting for something. Their movements were coordinated, almost as if they were professionals, trained to handle situations like this. The eerie silence that hung in the air made Jake's stomach churn. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "Stay calm," Jake said, his voice steady despite the rising tension. "We'll make it out of this. We just need to think." But even as he spoke, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the mystery was deepening. Every twist and turn of this nightmare was revealing something even darker than they had anticipated. And it wasn't just the people in the woods that worried him. It was the possibility that the people behind this had known they were coming for the files all along. The mystery behind the conspiracy was thickening, and with each passing second, it seemed like the web of lies and corruption was expanding. They weren't just trying to uncover the truth. They were trying to survive long enough to expose it. And just when it seemed like there was no way out, one of the masked figures stepped forward, holding something in their gloved hands. A small device. Jake's heart skipped a beat. Could it be? Was this the moment they'd been dreading? The moment the files were going to be destroyed, lost forever? Before he could react, the device beeped once, and the figures stepped back, signaling the others to stand down. There was a collective exhale, but Jake knew this was far from over. The figures slowly retreated into the darkness, their mission seemingly complete for now. But Jake and Sarah knew better than to think they had won. The truth was still out there. But now, the question was, how much further would they have to go to uncover it all? What other secrets had been buried, waiting to be revealed? The mystery was only deepening, and it seemed there was no end to the danger they would have to face to expose the truth. The morning sun peeked over the horizon, casting a golden glow across the forest clearing. But inside the small cabin where Jake and Sarah had taken refuge, the world felt far darker. The events of the previous night had left an indelible mark, not just on their bodies, but on their minds, too. They hadn't been able to sleep for more than a few hours. Sleep felt like an impossible luxury now, as they tried to make sense of the chaos that had unfolded. In the moments that followed their narrow escape, everything had moved in a blur. The masked figures that had surrounded their vehicle had mysteriously backed off, but the sense of dread lingered in the air. They knew it was only a temporary reprieve. Whoever was behind the criminal network was willing to go to any lengths to prevent the truth from coming out. And now, it seemed like Jake and Sarah had become the primary targets in a dangerous game of cat and mouse. With Max resting by his side, Jake's eyes scanned the room, his mind replaying the terrifying moments over and over again. It wasn't just the files they'd uncovered that had changed everything. It was the realization that the criminal syndicate was far-reaching and more powerful than anyone could have imagined. They had no choice now but to expose the truth, even if it meant putting their lives on the line. Jake, Sarah's voice broke through his thoughts, shaking him out of his reverie. She was standing by the window, her eyes fixed on the road that led out of the forest. Her expression was a mixture of concern and uncertainty. We need to get the information to the right people, but I'm not sure who we can trust anymore. Jake turned, his mind working through the possibilities. Who could they trust? Who would believe them? The web of corruption was so tightly woven that anyone they reached out to might already be compromised. But they couldn't just sit here and do nothing. I know, he said, running a hand through his hair, his frustration mounting. But we don't have a choice. We can't just let it end here. As the morning wore on, Jake and Sarah gathered their things, preparing to leave the cabin. They knew they couldn't stay here much longer. Someone would be coming for them soon enough. Their next step was to find someone trustworthy who could help them expose the truth, someone who had the means and power to bring down the syndicate. Max, the ever-vigilant K9, remained by their side, his protective instincts never wavering. It was as if the bond between them had grown even stronger through the ordeal, his presence providing a sense of calm amid the uncertainty. As they drove down the winding road, the weight of their decision pressed heavily on them. They were on the edge now. They had uncovered a truth that could shake the very foundations of the system, but exposing it would require courage they weren't sure they had. And with every mile, the sense of danger grew. The gang's reach extended far beyond what they had initially understood. They weren't just fighting a group of criminals anymore. They were challenging an entire network of power, and that network wasn't going to fall without a fight. Hours passed in silence, the road stretching endlessly ahead of them. Sarah's mind raced, her thoughts consumed by the task ahead. What would happen if they were caught? What if they were silenced before they could reveal the truth? And what would happen to the people who were unknowingly tangled up in this web? Jake, sensing her unease, glanced over at her. We're doing the right thing. This isn't just about us. It's about everyone who's been wronged, everyone who's been silenced. She nodded slowly, though her worry was far from gone. As they neared the town, the sight of familiar landmarks did little to calm the unease gnawing at her. She knew they couldn't go home. No place would be safe. But she also knew that they couldn't stop now. The lives of too many people were at stake, and they couldn't turn back. They reached a secluded spot just outside of town where they planned to meet with someone who had promised to help, an old friend of Jake's from his police days. The person who had reached out to them was a former detective, someone who had worked the streets for years and had the connections to move within the circles of power. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot they had left. As they pulled up to the meeting location, Jake's hand instinctively went to the back seat, his fingers brushing Max's fur. The K9 had remained a constant source of strength, both physical and emotional. Without Max, they might have never made it this far. The meeting went smoothly, too smoothly, as Jake would later reflect. They were given the reassurance they needed, but something fell off. The detective had promised them safe passage, but there were no guarantees in a world this corrupted. The syndicate they were up against had eyes everywhere. The detective's connections were no match for the power they were about to face. But for the moment it was all they had. And as they walked away, the realization settled in. The aftermath wasn't just about surviving. It was about making sure that the truth reached those who could make a difference, no matter the cost. They had already risked everything. Now, all they could do was hope that their next move would be enough to stop the tide of corruption before it swallowed everything in its path. The mystery of the gang was still unfolding, and with each new revelation, the stakes grew higher. But as the wheels of fate continued to turn, Jake, Sarah, and Max knew one thing for sure. They couldn't back down now. They had come too far, and the fight for justice was only just beginning. As Jake, Sarah, and Max stood outside the building, the final pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. They had risked everything, uncovered secrets that could topple governments, and revealed a criminal network so vast it seemed impossible to defeat. But as they prepared to hand over the files to the trusted detective, a chilling realization hit them. It was too easy. Suddenly, the sound of sirens cut through the quiet night. Panic surged through Jake's veins. It couldn't be. Were they too late? The detectives they thought they trusted had been compromised. Just as the realization dawned, a sleek black car skidded to a stop in front of them. The door swung open, revealing the detective they'd met earlier. But he wasn't alone. He wasn't on their side. Before they could react, a dozen masked figures emerged from the shadows, surrounding them. The files, they were never meant to be handed over. This was the final play in a game that had been rigged from the start. The mystery had deepened beyond anything they could have imagined. The battle for the truth wasn't over. It was just beginning. As the masked figures closed in, Jake looked one last time at Sarah and Max. Their fight for justice had just reached its most dangerous crossroads. With nowhere left to run, they'd have to make one final stand. But would they survive long enough to expose the truth?